The world remembers the day. August 6, 1945. At 8:15 in the morning, the clear summer sky over Hiroshima was pierced by a light brighter than 1,000 suns. In a single, horrifying instant, a city was erased, and with it, tens of thousands of lives. Humanity had unleashed a weapon of unimaginable power, nicknamed Little Boy, ushering in the atomic age with a roar of fire and a cloud shaped like a mushroom. But that moment wasn't the beginning. It was the final terrible step on a long and secret road. It was the culmination of a desperate race against a terrifying enemy, a series of high-stakes political gambles, and scientific breakthroughs that pushed the very limits of human knowledge. The path to that day was paved with impossible choices, whispered secrets, and a momentum that became unstoppable. To truly understand the weight of August 6th, we can't just look at the explosion. We have to trace the timeline backward to unravel the complex web of decisions and discoveries that made the atomic age a reality. We have to go back years, to a time before the secret cities and the celebrated scientists, to a time when the bomb was just a terrifying idea in a physics laboratory. Before the soldiers, the secret labs, or the code names, there was only the science. Our story starts not on a battlefield, but in a laboratory in Berlin in the winter of 1938. Two German chemists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, were bombarding uranium with neutrons, and what they found defied all explanation. The uranium atoms weren't just being shipped. They were splitting apart, releasing a tremendous amount of energy. They had discovered nuclear fission. The news shot through the international physics community. In Sweden, physicist Lisa Meitner, who had just fled Nazi Germany, and her nephew Otto Frisch were the first to correctly interpret what was happening. They realized this process didn't just release energy, it also released more neutrons. And those neutrons could, in theory, go on to split other uranium atoms. This was the key. This was the dawn of a terrifying possibility, a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. This discovery couldn't have come at a worse time. Adolf Hitler's Germany was on the march. Among the physicists who understood the power of fission, a chilling fear began to grow. Many of these scientists were refugees who had fled persecution in Europe. They knew firsthand what the Nazi regime would be capable of if it got its hands on a weapon based on their discovery. Three of these refugees, the Hungarian physicists Leo Szilard, Eugene Wigner, and Edward Teller, were especially alarmed. Szilard, a brilliant and often prescient mind, realized that Germany had the scientific talent, the industrial might, and the ruthless ambition to build an atomic bomb. But Szilard and his friends weren't big names in the United States. To be heard in the corridors of power, they needed a voice no one could ignore. So they turned to the most famous scientist in the world, Albert Einstein. Einstein, a devoted pacifist, was living a quiet life in Princeton, New Jersey, after fleeing Germany himself. He was skeptical at first, but Szilard's passionate arguments convinced him of the grave danger. Together, they drafted a letter. Dated August 2, 1939, the Einstein-Szilard letter was a stark warning addressed to U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. It explained the possibility of constructing extremely powerful bombs of a new type and pointed out that Germany had already stopped the sale of uranium from the Czechoslovakian mines. It had seized a clear sign they were on the path to a bomb. The letter urged the U.S. government to act immediately. It wasn't delivered to Roosevelt until October by an economist and presidential confidant named Alexander Sachs. Grasping the immense stakes, Roosevelt famously said, "Alex, what you are after is to see that the Nazis don't blow us up." He immediately authorized the creation of the Advisory Committee on Uranium. The first tentative step had been taken. The spark of an idea, born in a German lab and fanned by the fears of refugee scientists, had now landed on the desk of the most powerful man in the world. Roosevelt's Uranium Committee was a start, but a slow one. For 2 years, the American effort was a small, fragmented research program that lacked any real urgency. In Britain, however, the threat was felt much more acutely. The British MAUD Committee had been conducting its own intensive research, and in the summer of 1941, they produced a stunning report. They concluded a uranium bomb was feasible and could be built in time to affect the war's outcome. The MAUD report was a jolt to the American system. Vannevar Bush, the head of the newly created Office of Scientific Research and Development, now had the proof he needed to push for an all-out program. The final catalyst came on December 7, 1941, with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The abstract threat of a new weapon became a terrifying reality in a world now at total war. The day after Pearl Harbor, Bush met with Roosevelt and got the green light to mobilize everything required to build the bomb. In January 1942, President Roosevelt formally and secretly approved the massive undertaking. A project of this scale needed more than scientific genius. It needed an organizational titan. In September 1942, they found their man, Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Groves was a force of nature, demanding, abrasive, and relentlessly focused. His last project was building the Pentagon. He knew how to manage colossal undertakings, and he was precisely what the sprawling, disorganized project needed. As his aide later put it, he was the biggest SOB I have ever worked for, but also a man of unquestioned ability. One of Groves' first acts was to give the project its deliberately misleading name. Because its first office was in New York City, it was designated the Manhattan Engineer District. The name stuck, becoming the code name for the entire top-secret enterprise, the Manhattan Project. Groves immediately approved the purchase of 1,250 tons of high-quality uranium ore stored on Staten Island and moved with lightning speed to acquire vast tracts of land for the facilities that would be needed. The race was now a full-out sprint. The project was about to become a nationwide industrial and scientific effort, all hidden from public view. And to lead its scientific heart, Groves would make his most crucial and perhaps most unlikely decision. He needed a scientific director, and he found him in a brilliant, enigmatic, and controversial theoretical physicist named J. Robert Oppenheimer. With General Groves providing the industrial muscle, the Manhattan Project shifted into high gear. The scientific problem was immense, but the industrial challenge was even greater. The scientists had identified 2 potential paths to a weapon, 2 different materials that could sustain a chain reaction. No one was sure which would work, so they had to pursue both at once. The first path involved uranium-235. Natural uranium is over 99% a stable isotope. U-238, only a tiny fraction, about 0.7%, is the fissile isotope U-235. The challenge was to separate this needle from a haystack. To do it, a secret city rose from the mud of eastern Tennessee. Code-named Site X, it would become Oak Ridge. In just 2 years, a 17-mile-long valley was filled with enormous industrial plants. The largest, the K-25 plant, was one of the biggest buildings in the world under a single roof at the time. It housed miles of pipes and machinery designed to filter uranium gas, stage by stage, to slowly increase the concentration of U-235. At its peak, Oak Ridge consumed an astonishing amount of the nation's electricity and employed nearly 75,000 people. The second path involved a new man-made element, plutonium. Scientists discovered that when the common U-238 isotope absorbed a neutron, it transformed into plutonium-239. This new element was highly fissile and could be created in a nuclear reactor. The advantage was that it could be separated from uranium chemically, a much simpler process. First, though, they had to prove a self-sustaining chain reaction was even possible. On December 2, 1942, under the stands of the University of Chicago's football field, Enrico Fermi's team did just that. Their Chicago Pile 1, a carefully stacked pile of graphite and uranium, went critical. Following this success, another secret city was built, this time in the remote desert of Washington State. At Site W or Hanford, giant nuclear reactors were built to create plutonium. Tying these secret cities together was an all-encompassing veil of secrecy. Most of the 130,000 people who worked on the Manhattan Project had no idea what they were building. At Oak Ridge, billboards reminded them, "What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here." They operated complex machinery and monitored dials without understanding the final purpose. It was a compartmentalized world designed by General Groves to ensure that only a select few at the very top understood the full picture. This hidden industrial empire was the foundation, but designing the bomb itself would require a different kind of place. While the factories at Oak Ridge and Hanford churned out the fuel, the project needed a central brain, a place to turn theoretical physics into practical engineering. General Groves knew he needed a secret, remote laboratory where the world's most brilliant scientists could be focused on a single task. The man chosen to lead this new lab, J. Robert Oppenheimer, found the perfect spot on a remote mesa in the New Mexico desert, the Los Alamos Ranch School. In late 1942, the government acquired the site and a frantic period of construction began. Project Y, as it was codenamed, would soon be home to an unparalleled collection of scientific minds. Oppenheimer proved to be a masterful recruiter, convincing top physicists, chemists, and engineers to uproot their lives for a job he could barely describe. He brought in Nobel laureates like Enrico Fermi, brilliant minds like Hans Bethe, and a brash young physicist named Richard Feynman. The dynamic between the stern, pragmatic General Groves and the charismatic, intellectual Oppenheimer was a study in contrasts, but their unlikely partnership drove the project forward. Despite Oppenheimer's lack of administrative experience, Groves saw the genius and overweening ambition needed to get the job done. It was, as one colleague later said, a real stroke of genius on the part of General Groves, who was not generally considered to be a genius. Life at Los Alamos was a paradox. It was an isolated, heavily guarded military post, yet inside the gates, Oppenheimer fostered an atmosphere of intense, open collaboration. The scientists worked with a feverish intensity, driven by the fear that Germany was ahead in the race for the bomb. The lab was focused on solving two problems. The first was the gun-type design for the uranium bomb. The concept was simple: fire one subcritical piece of U-235 into another to create a critical mass. This design was considered so reliable it wouldn't need a full-scale test. The bomb was nicknamed Little Boy. The plutonium bomb was far more complex. Plutonium from the reactors was prone to pre-detonation. A gun-type design would be too slow. The bomb would fizzle. A radical new solution was needed: implosion. A hollow sphere of plutonium would be surrounded by precisely shaped explosives. When detonated, they would create a perfectly symmetrical shock wave, crushing the plutonium core and forcing it to go critical. It was an idea of staggering technical difficulty. This complex device, nicknamed Fat Man, was the lab's greatest challenge. As the months turned to years, the scientists at Los Alamos worked against the clock, certain that the fate of the world depended on their success. As the scientists in New Mexico raced to perfect their weapons, the world outside was changing. By the spring of 1945, Allied forces were closing in on Nazi Germany. The original driving fear of the Manhattan Project, that Hitler would get the bomb first, was fading. Allied intelligence teams found little evidence of a serious German nuclear program. Then, on May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. The war in Europe was over. For many of the scientists, the news was met with a complex mix of relief and profound unease. The primary reason for their work had vanished. There was no longer a race against Hitler. This created a sudden moral crisis. With the original enemy defeated, what was the purpose of the bomb? The project had built up a colossal momentum, a $2 billion machine on the cusp of success. Had it taken on a life of its own? A group of scientists in Chicago became increasingly vocal. Leo Szilard, the man who had started it all with his letter to Roosevelt, was now one of the project's most passionate critics. He drafted the Szilard petition, signed by dozens of scientists, arguing against using the bomb on a Japanese city. They begged President Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's death, to first demonstrate the bomb's power in an unpopulated area. These concerns were brought before a secret body known as the Interim Committee, which included Oppenheimer and Fermi. The option of a non-lethal demonstration was seriously considered, but ultimately rejected. What if the bomb was a dud? The shock value would be lost. What if the Japanese moved American POWs into the area? They concluded that a demonstration was too risky and might not be enough to compel Japan's surrender. The committee recommended using the bomb on a city without prior warning, on a military facility surrounded by civilian homes. The focus of the war and the purpose of the bomb had shifted entirely to the Pacific. The war against Japan was still raging with unimaginable ferocity. The bloody island-hopping campaigns and the emergence of kamikaze attacks painted a grim picture of an invasion. The bomb was no longer about stopping a Nazi apocalypse. It was now about ending the war with Japan, and in the minds of the decision-makers, saving American lives. The moral calculus had changed. With Germany defeated, the full might of the Allies turned toward Japan. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa in the spring of 1945 were a horrific preview of what an invasion of the mainland would be like. On Okinawa, the fighting was savage. Japanese soldiers fought to the last man, and tens of thousands of civilians died, many taking their own lives. The U.S. military suffered staggering casualties. Planners were mapping out Operation Downfall, the Allied invasion of Japan's home islands. It would be the largest amphibious assault in history. Casualty estimates were chilling, projecting up to 1 million Allied casualties and millions of Japanese casualties. The Japanese leadership was preparing the entire population for a final battle, training women and children to fight with bamboo spears. The prospect was a bloodbath. It was in this context that President Harry Truman, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin met in Potsdam, Germany. In July 1945, Truman had just received word that the secret test of the atomic bomb had been a stunning success. This new, terrible power now factored heavily into his calculations. On July 26th, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, a final ultimatum to Japan. It called for unconditional surrender, warning that the alternative was prompt and utter destruction. The phrase was a veiled but unmistakable threat. The Japanese government's response was tragic. Internally, the leadership was divided. A peace faction sought a way to end the war, while a hardline military faction was determined to fight on, believing one final, apocalyptic battle would force the Allies to offer better terms. When the Potsdam Declaration was received, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki publicly stated that his government would treat it with makusatsu. It's a Japanese word with a fateful ambiguity. It can mean to take no notice of, or to treat with silent contempt. The Allies, waiting for a clear reply, interpreted it as a flat rejection. In their eyes, Japan had slammed the door on a peaceful surrender. The stage was set. Back in the New Mexico desert, at a site Oppenheimer had grimly named Trinity, the scientists of Los Alamos prepared for the ultimate test. The complex plutonium device, the gadget, was the project's great unknown. No one was sure if the intricate dance of explosives and shockwaves would actually work. In the pre-dawn hours of July 16, 1945, the gadget sat atop a 100-foot steel tower. As the final countdown began, the project's leaders watched from bunkers miles away. At exactly 5:29 a.m., it detonated. The reaction was one of primal awe. An initial flash of light was so brilliant it seemed to outshine the sun, followed by a deep, rumbling roar that echoed across the desert. A massive, churning ball of fire rolled and grew, rising into the sky and blooming into the iconic, terrifying mushroom cloud. The observers were stunned into silence. General Groves's deputy, Thomas Farrell, called it that beauty the great poets dream about, but describe most poorly ... the grand finale of a mighty symphony. But for J. Robert Oppenheimer, the moment was far more somber. As he watched the cloud ascend, a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, came to his mind. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. It was a haunting recognition of the terrible power they had unlocked. The Trinity test was an unequivocal, terrifying success. The news was immediately cabled in secret code to President Truman at Potsdam. The baby had been born satisfactorily. This knowledge emboldened Truman and solidified his resolve. The atomic bomb was no longer a theory. It was a proven reality. The weapon worked. The only question that remained was where and when it would be used. The successful Trinity test sealed the bomb's fate. With Japan's public rejection of the Potsdam Ultimatum, President Truman and his advisors saw the path as clear. The primary justification, they repeated, was to save American lives by avoiding a catastrophic invasion. The grim task of choosing the specific targets fell to a committee at Los Alamos, led by General Groves. They established a set of criteria. The target had to be a city of military and industrial importance, large enough to accurately measure the bomb's effects, and crucially, it needed to be largely untouched by the ongoing firebombing campaigns. They wanted a clean slate to measure the full power of this new weapon. The initial list included Kyoto, Japan's ancient capital. However, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who admired its cultural heritage, argued forcefully for its removal. He believed destroying such a cherished city would embitter the Japanese people for generations. Truman agreed, and Kyoto was spared. A new primary target was chosen, Hiroshima. It met all the criteria perfectly. It was an important military headquarters, a major port, and a center for logistics. Its geography, a flat plain surrounded by hills, was thought to create a focusing effect that would amplify the blast. And it was one of the few major cities that had not yet been subjected to major bombing raids. The final list was approved. Hiroshima was the primary target, with Kakura and Nagasaki as alternates. On July 25, 1945, from Potsdam, Truman gave the final authorization. General Thomas Handy issued the formal order to the U.S. Army Strategic Air Forces. The 509th Composite Group was to deliver its first special bomb as soon as weather will permit visual bombing after about the 3rd of August 1945. On one of the targets, Hiroshima, Kakura, Niigata, and Nagasaki, the orders were cut. All the years of research, secrecy, and impossible choices were now converging on a single city and a single day. On the remote Pacific island of Tinian, the final phase of the project was underway. Inside the world's busiest airbase was a highly secure area, home of the 509th Composite Group. Only a handful of these elite airmen knew the true nature of their mission. In late July, the components of the Little Boy bomb arrived. It was a gun-type weapon. Inside its 9,000-pound casing, a short cannon would fire a uranium bullet into a uranium target, initiating the nuclear chain reaction. On August 5th, the weather forecast for the next day over Japan looked clear. Colonel Paul Tibbets, commander of the 509th, told his crew this was the mission they had been training for. He revealed they would be dropping a new kind of bomb, one with the explosive force of about 15,000 tons of TNT. That afternoon, he named the B-29 he would pilot Enola Gay after his mother. In the early hours of August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay lumbered down the runway and lifted into the dark sky. The flight was long and uneventful. Over the ocean, Navy Captain William Deke Parsons performed the final assembly of the bomb, a precaution against an accident on takeoff. As they approached Japan, the sun was rising. The skies over Hiroshima were clear. At 8:15 a.m., from an altitude of over 31,000 feet, the bombardier, Major Thomas Farabee, took aim at the Aioi Bridge. The bomb bay doors opened, and Little Boy fell away. The plane banked into a hard diving turn. For 43 seconds, the bomb plummeted. Then, at an altitude of 1,968 feet, it detonated. A blinding flash of light filled the cockpit, even miles away. Moments later, the first of two shockwaves struck the plane. The tail gunner, Bob Coron, was the first to report what he saw. A massive, turbulent cloud rising over the city, a column of black smoke and purple-gray fire, boiling and churning. Below, where Hiroshima had been just a minute before, there was nothing but a sea of fire and a thick, dark pall of smoke. The mission was complete. The world had been violently and forever thrust into the atomic age. The bombing of Hiroshima, and 3 days later Nagasaki, brought the Second World War to a sudden, horrific close. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, citing the devastating power of a new and most cruel bomb. The planned invasion of Japan, with its projected millions of casualties, would never happen. But the legacy of August 6th is far from simple. Over the next few months, the two atomic bombs killed between 150,000 and 246,000 people, the vast majority of them civilians. They introduced the specter of nuclear annihilation to the world, casting a shadow over global politics that persists to this day. The decision to use the bomb remains one of the most debated actions in history. Was it a necessary evil to prevent a greater loss of life? Or was it an unnecessary atrocity inflicted on a nation that was already on the verge of surrender? The path to Hiroshima wasn't one of evil men, but of brilliant, flawed, and often frightened people working under immense pressure in a time of total war. It began with a scientific discovery, was propelled by a justified fear of a monstrous enemy, and grew into a secret industrial colossus with a momentum all its own. The story of what led to that day is a chilling lesson about the weapons we create and the wisdom we must summon to control them. The mushroom cloud that rose over Hiroshima cast a shadow that reaches all the way to the present, a permanent question mark hanging over the future of humanity. If you found this exploration of the complex history behind the atomic bomb compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. And we'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments below. The decision to use the bomb is still debated today. What are your thoughts on this pivotal moment in history? Thank you for watching.